Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
Well, it's been a long time coming. The third member of the great triumvirate. Golf has Braid, Varden, Taylor, and over in Ireland they have Colin, Carney, and now the third spoke of the wheel. I suppose bad analogy on top of that. Olly Logan, welcome to the show.
Hi, Stu. Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to be on here.
I was actually thinking about that triumvirate analogy, and actually it's probably not fair. It's more like the Musketeers, isn't it? Because actually the D'Artagnan of the group is Alan Dunton, who's the kind of machine behind everything happening, isn't it?
Yeah, he does actually all the legwork and all the social media and all the admin stuff. He basically is Ed Coughlin's personal assistant, and he doesn't get paid for it. So, but Ed will strenuously deny that, but that's the truth.
Ed will probably want to lay claim to being D'Artagnan, but I'm going to give that to Alan. I think he's got that.
Yeah.
And actually, Alan's he did some really good stuff the other day at the ESAN conference, which I know we'll cover at some point. Mm-hmm. But it'd be great to get him on because some of his stuff in Taekwondo is really fascinating as well. Yeah, anyway, over to you. Hey, give us your story. We've obviously been swimming in the same circles, and excuse the pun.
Yep.
But tell the world about you.
So I suppose I'll probably work backwards. It's an easier trail for me. So my current role is I'm analysis lead for British Swimming, and that's probably quite a mix of different areas. So it is I'm in charge of the performance analysis of competition within British Swimming. So your standard kind of performance analysis setup, where we analyze kind of competition results and performances and kind of report that back in using video and different metrics. That then feeds into the training environment where we do biomechanical analysis on the athletes, where we kind of maybe identify sections where they're potentially weak against competitors in competition, and then we further break that down into using biomechanical analysis and have a help of a number of kind of really good PhD students to assist with that, and that's based in the centres. And then once we identify maybe some areas of development for the athletes, then that's where it kind of links into the skill acquisition part, which is really interesting for me about how we go about modifying or improving skill through the work of the coaches as well. And then kind of surrounding all of that, I'm heavily involved in what I would call a research and innovation program. So that's I currently have work with 4 PhD students. There'll be 5 starting in June. Just helping us understand the mystical world of swimming, because we know a little bit and there's a ton of research that's going on in it, but it's a hugely complex world to try and understand in terms of hydrodynamics and stuff like that. And so we're trying to learn a little bit more about that. So I've been there since 2017. Before that, I'd spent I think it was 11 years at the English Institute of Sport. Predominantly, my background is as a biomechanist. So I would have normally worked in again, I used it on Wednesday, inverted commas, technical sports, or where technique is important for the outcome of the sport. Mm-hmm. I would probably use the term skill, which encompasses technique and outcome. So I would have a long association with archery and para-archery. but also table tennis, wheelchair basketball, athletics, and then various projects with like badminton, bobskeleton. So yeah, pretty wide ranging work there. And I think probably in about 2009, 2010, I got really interested in skill acquisition and motor learning through ESAN actually, and through the opportunities that were availed of there. So that's where my interest came into that. And then before that, basically I'd never any intention of getting into sport. When I was at university, I actually did physics as an undergrad, because I like maths and I like numbers, and there's no other reason for me to do that. And then eventually midway through the third year, I think I got fed up with the quantum mechanics lectures on a Thursday morning with a hangover. That just didn't work well. So I had a bit of what am I going to do now? And actually I went to a visiting lecture by a guy called Professor Steve Hake, who works in kind of sports engineering in Sheffield. He's at Sheffield Hallam University now. And he opened up this kind of world of where they used biomechanics and engineering analysis and had an impact on sports performance. And I said, oh, that's interesting. So that kind of stimulated me to go to Liverpool John Moores and do a master's in sports biomechanics. And after that, after I got my qualification, I got an internship at EIS. So yeah, I think that joins up most of the dots. It's probably, as people can probably tell by my accent, I'm from Northern Ireland and I currently live in Northern Ireland and commute over and back to the UK for my sins. So I know people think that's crazy, but I enjoy my job, so that's why I do that.
Many air miles, no doubt.
Yeah, I mean, if I got air miles with EasyJet, that would be fantastic. But, all they do is seem to take my money and give me nothing back, apart from days and small seats. So,
we could. There's a whole new podcast talking about the constraints of air travel. But also, you're pretty active coaching wise as well, aren't you?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a qualified hockey coach, so I played hockey all through school. Got to a decent level, played National League in England, but was never ever going to be any better than decent in my estimation. And I'm also a level 2 cycling coach as well. So I do back at home in Northern Ireland. I do a lot of work around youth development, just with my club, and it's nothing more than like on Saturday mornings with kids that range from just getting on a bike to decent under 14 and under 16 level. And that for me is just if we think of a spectrum of I work probably at elite end with British Swimming, that is very much participation level. And I find that's really useful just to give me a bit of perspective, and just having kids out enjoying themselves on the bikes. That's all that is. So that's really, really worthwhile. And I try and integrate some of the stuff in terms of my knowledge, but it's nothing more than just participation and kids having fun. So.
It's interesting how you use an interesting phrase there, not to want to delve down this participation rabbit hole, but I will. Interesting phrase, it's nothing more than. And I think for me, when I hear somebody saying, you work in this elite world, right? So a lot of people assume that, you're this hard-faced elite science type, right? Who all just cares about, microseconds and all that sort of stuff. But then you're actively participating in the participation space. But I think there is a little bit of a cultural problem we have, which is we see that participatory activity as somehow being of less value. And that's obviously been translated in the way coach education goes, and, far more resources are put into your so-called level 4 coach. But for me, I've always been a massive believer that the people at the coalface volunteering, doing that kind of work, providing great experiences, getting kids to love their sport, then developing a little bit and then progressing somewhere else. It's a really valuable role in the industry that just sort of doesn't quite have that kind of cultural and social value.
And I think I probably used that term because that was, for me personally, I'm not motivated to get people to move on to performance.
Yeah, I get it.
As long as they're having fun, they're enjoying the sessions, they're coming back, and more people are coming in, then that kind of floats my boat and ticks my box.
I see.
I suppose at the elite end, I'm getting that bit. Whereas I'd like, and I do see coaches, that work in that participation space. There is a little bit of a kind of a trophy element to it about getting people progressing and winning and stuff like that. Yeah. Whereas I suppose I've kind of resolved I don't necessarily need that. It's more about the participation for me.
I get it. So, but when you said nothing more, what you mean is it's got its own value. It's not there to serve a purpose of progression. It's there with its own value. And actually, that's a great point, because actually, I think if more people had that mentality, I think, well, firstly, we wouldn't have such a major issue in terms of low levels of activity and increased obesity, etc., etc.
Yeah, and I mean, if I'm to draw out performance metrics out of that, it's right, how many of these kids are coming back, how many are leaving with a smile on their face, and how many of the other parents are messaging me on WhatsApp and later on going, my kids are still out in the garden and it's getting dark and they're still out on their bike, or you're building little cyclo-cross courses or stuff like that. I mean, that's a big win for me. So.
How did you, I mean, they're two very different sports, aren't they? I mean, you've got that kind of team dynamic hockey, and then you've got the cycling. Have you always cycled and then just decided to follow that path as well, or is it just something that came later?
No, it was something that came later. So I probably I finished playing hockey when I was about 30, motivated by just lack of time to commit to training. I mean, I wanted to play at a decent level and I couldn't commit the time to do that. So I didn't want to go down levels. It would have been frustrating for me. Also, as per standard, most hockey players had short hamstrings and a bad back and was rolling out of bed in the morning in pain. So I just didn't want that anymore.
I know where you're coming from.
Yeah, I'm sure you can appreciate that. So yeah, I just bought a bike and really enjoyed it in terms of I could train in my own time, and then it gradually progressed to joining the club, and then seeing the kids cycle, and I was like, hey, I could offer something here. And then I just wanted to get some qualifications to be able to do some coaching, and that's where it kind of progressed to. And I suppose, I mean, specifically, I coach a lot more in one of the elements of cycling called cyclo-cross, which is essentially a mix between road cycling and mountain biking. Yeah. So they have the knobbly tires, but it basically looks like a road bike. And in that space, it's essentially an exploration of a park or a landscape. Yeah. And it's safer for the kids in that it's not on the road, and it's a lot more stimulating, and it actually just develops fundamental kind of cycling skills, such as cornering, braking, balance, and stuff like that. An environment that's fun. So where we do it, the landscape just naturally invites curiosity, exploration, and fun. And we don't need to actually do very much around. I'll use the word drills. We don't need to do any drills there. We don't need to do anything, because we just go, right, there's a couple of hills, go explore, I'll put some challenges on you, and they just, it's a really, I find it a really easy sport to coach, because of the demands of the sport.
I don't know much about cyclocross. I mean, obviously I've seen it, but is it one of those things where you just kind of find a space in nature and then like exploit it a little bit? I mean, from the perspective of or do you have specific places that you go to in order to kind of practice, or is it a bit of both?
Yeah, I suppose cyclocross races are generally off road. They wouldn't be like a mountain bike tracks, but I suppose they're a mix of grassland, kind of woodland, and like an even gravel. And most of it is on the bike, but there are some hurdles you have to navigate. So you have to get off the bike and run over the hurdles. They'll do off camber slopes. Generally it's in the winter when it's wet, muddy and cold. Yeah. But it's basically an hour kind of flat out for the men's races. But for the kids, they're generally on the same courses and maybe just less of a length. So the kids I work with, I mean, you might have something that's under 10, under 12, it's a 10-minute race, up to under 16s, which is like a 30-minute race. Right. But I mean, a lot of top road bike riders have background in cyclocross and off-road. So people who know this area will know that currently there's two guys, Wout van Aert and Mathieu van der Poel, who are great cyclocross champions in their own right from Belgium and the Netherlands, and are currently doing really well on the road scene. Just again, and partly because of that is because of their training background and their conditioning, but they just have fabulous bike handling skills. So as a sport for me, it progresses the kids to have great bike handling skills, which will support them if they decide to go on road and moving forward. And even within the club that we're with in Northern Ireland, we've had 4 or 5 kind kids come through to be really, really good and represent their country at kind of national level. And all of them, they didn't even have coaching. I think they took their mountain bikes up into the mountains, and just 4 or 5 of them just explored spaces and created tracks. No coaches, just that kind of, I suppose, that kind of skateboard learning environment, that kind of, mountain biking learning environment, and they just had fun. And that was their development. So that's kind of what I'm trying to replicate.
So, I mean, it's interesting what you've said there. I mean, you've got essentially bike handling skills, right? So road cycling, it's all about wattage, isn't it? It's just all about kind of aerobic capacity. And
you're going fishing here, Stu, aren't you?
As if, but yeah, I mean, that is generally a perception. I think I would imagine. I mean, and I'm coming at this as a layperson.
Yeah.
You've just described in a road scene, which in my opinion is about somebody basically just being the engine for a piece of equipment. And traditionally, in my mind, the world of, say, something like cycling would focus very, very heavily on the idea of, let's make that engine as efficient as possible. And I get that, and I bet that's still a massive part of it. But you've also now added another dimension, which is the idea of the handling of the bike being advantageous. Mm-hmm. I need to find out more about that.
So if we use a road cycling example of you're an individual and you're in a peloton of 100 riders, you need to be able to react to what's going on around you. Sure. So if you think of a mass amount of people, there's going to be some kind of chaos theory in terms of one person moves beside you, you're going to have to react to that. So your bike handling skills are really important to be able to do that. You need to be able to ride and have one hand free to take a drink or take something out of your back pocket. If there is a crash, you need to be able to evade that. If the roads are slippy and your kind of back wheel goes, you need to be able to react to that. You might need to hurdle over some what's called road furniture or curbs or stuff like that. So having an engine is fine if you want to be a time trial rider and ride in a straight direction down a road. But if you want to, and it doesn't even have to be in a road race. If you're someone who uses a bike to commute in and out of work, there's enough things that you have to avoid in cities and with drivers and stuff like that. So I think it's universally applicable. It's definitely seen as advantageous to have better bike handling skills in competitive cycling, particularly in sprint finishes, where you need to be comfortable to move evasively. So.
And beyond the evasion side, I imagine, I just want to test a bit of an idea and a theory with you. I remember reading a really interesting article. No, it was a documentary about the skier Bodie Miller.
Yeah.
And one of the things he talked about was he lived in the mountains, grew up in backcountry, would hike up hills to be able to take a fresh field of powder, all that stuff, basically, and became, as a result, really, he also said, very rarely got ill. And he believes that he developed through basically being out in the cold and in the fresh air on a daily basis and kind of living in that space that, he developed this sort of kind of like a resilience and a hardiness and this, that, and the other. And so you just mentioned that cyclo-cross, wet and cold, and you're performing this activity on a lot of variable terrain, and you've got a lot of problems to solve in terms of maximizing your, there's a lot of tactical dimensions, I imagine, in terms of, when you push, when you don't, how you navigate obstacles, how you press on different terrains. And I imagine I can see, obviously, with my ecological lens putting on everything, that the variability associated with cycling cross could be hugely advantageous to then going into a road scenario.
Yeah, and the thing, again, if people listen to this, want to go and they can Google or they can look on YouTube cyclocross world championships. The thing that's fascinating about cyclocross is that the course deteriorates as the race goes on.
Yeah. So
the fastest line on one lap will change over the course of the race. So the racing line technically changes. So the fastest way around a corner in cyclocross isn't necessarily the shortest line, because you got to think about grip. You got to think about, I'm going to slip here. All those kind of things. So tactically, it's an exploration of problem solving about, right, what's the fastest way around this course, and it changes from lap to lap. And that's why for me, because I compete in it as well, it's so much more stimulating than being on the road, which can get a bit monotonous if you're not with other people. And that's why I kind of migrate towards there.
You made me think about something, actually. I'm reading a book at the moment, fascinating book called Born to Run.
Okay.
It's about this tribe in really very deepest, darkest Mexico called the Turahumara.
Yeah.
And they're barefoot runners.
Mm-hmm.
And part of their story also leads to the kind of whole barefoot running scene. But anyway, and what it talks about is, I mean, they run in like canyons and mountains, places that you'll get lost in. You'll go in there and you never come out again type of places, right? Huge levels of variability, really, really difficult terrain. What's interesting is their kids learn to run, and they're like ultra marathoners, right? So they'll go 50, 60 miles at a time, and this, that, and the other. And their kids learn to run by playing a game with a little wooden ball that they basically chase. They boot it and then they chase after it in the canyons and then all run back. And what was really interesting about it was how when they then went into like other racing contexts, how they were like they do like 100-mile marathon, right, in like the desert and stuff like that, and they're running in sandals, by the way, right, and they can essentially they'll destroy pretty much everybody in the field. Yeah, and a lot of that is put down to the fact that they're having to run initially in such a variable context that obviously then when they run in places that have got obviously a lot less variability, then they find it like it's like just a jog almost. Yeah. And it feels to me like there's something similar at play here. Yeah. I can definitely see the logic in that. And I think you mentioned obviously the environmental variability there, and that's I think that's exactly similar to what I see in cyclo-cross is it's not kids sitting on a bike on a road just pedaling round and round and not getting any stimulus to kind of move their body. They're having to be flexible and adaptable in a lot of those terrains and environments. So therefore they're having to use their body and their leg muscles in different ways to be able to adapt to that environment, and that creates variability which is going to be better for them in the long term. I'm sure we'll discuss this area and technique later on, but and again, that's another reason why I enjoy it, because they're having to, if they're having to hurdle things on the bike, it's like, right, how do you shift your gravity back and move it forward? That's another problem for you to solve. Is right, it's really slippy here. Is how do you shift your weight on the bike through moving your center of gravity, all that kind of stuff. It's and I love it. I love it because it's just a great problem solving environment. The skill. So, and that's probably a bit that people would often miss out, is the skill of cycling. A lot of it's like, for example, balance, isn't it? Yeah. Like you say, the positioning of your weight in order to be able to get maximum propulsion. Yeah. Really important, but very subtle, and something that requires a degree of time, I suppose, in order to be able to become attuned to, I would have said. Yeah, exactly. And if people, again, want an example of highly skilled cycling, you just look at some of the downhill mountain bikers, someone like a G. Atherton, and watch the GoPro footage from the helmet. I mean, it's incredible that they can go at the speeds over that terrain, and that's just they're just at one with the bike. They just have that great proprioceptive sense of where their body needs to be to get over that obstacle. Talking about mountain biking, for me, one of the things about downhill mountain biking in particular is the decision making. Yeah, I just can't fathom it. It's happening so fast. Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of them will recce the course and walk it and do kind of soft runs on it, but then when they go full tilt, it is an incredible sport to watch. Highly dangerous, but I mean, it's an example of that when a sport's done at such a high level. It's just incredible to watch. Yeah. And we actually, just going back to ESAN, and by the way, I mentioned ESAN at the start and didn't tell everybody what it was. Expertise and Skill Acquisition Network. It's an attempt, I think, to bring the academic community together with practitioners and try and sort of bridge the gap a little bit. I think we got some way towards that, but I definitely think there's more to do. One of the things I was thinking about that, though, was one of the things I heard a lot about was quite a lot of research around anticipation and visual gaze behavior and what's going on in the brain, all those sorts of things. Some quite interesting stuff there. It was a particularly interesting study by a young man whose name escapes me now, but he did an interesting study in rugby looking at like how people respond to movement and how an expert reacts later because they're looking for different information than a novice. A novice will get fooled by somebody's deceptive movement much more readily. But one thing I was going to ask you about was, in a cycling context then, whether it's a cyclo-cross or a downhill mountain biking or whatever, would you say then that sort of a more expert cyclist in that context, there's something similar there in terms of their ability to see what's happening ahead of them and adjust and adapt is happening in a different way than it would be for a more novice athlete? Would that be true of cycling as well, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably take some generalisms around visual search and quiet eye research. So I suppose experts are more able to identify the key environment and information they need to attune to. Mm-hmm. So if you're an expert cyclist and there's an obstacle coming up, they will look in the right position more often to be able to make a decision as a result of that. Yep. Whereas novice people will maybe try a bit, scan more the whole obstacle and go, right, what's going on here? Look at all of it and then try and take out the information. But that serves more as of a distraction and doesn't give them the critical information to make that decision. And that's, I'm generalizing from some of the research around a lot of the visual search. But that would be my kind of thought as to what would happen there.
Yeah, it's interesting. Lawrence Warren West, his name was.
Yes, that's correct.
I wanted to lose the really, really interesting thing. I mean, again, obviously limitations with the experimental design because obviously they're using a video and they're using photos, so it's a little bit artificial. But I thought there were still some interesting things within that we could find out about not in novice behaviour and expert behaviour. One of the challenges was I think the athletes he was using probably weren't what I would call expert. They were more developed than the novice, so that's fine. And then I think the question I want to pose, and this is where I'd like to maybe put that together with some practitioner stuff, would be around, well, how does somebody go about learning that? Because that was the question I was left with, and that was but of course I would think that.
I think in that kind of symposium, there was another guy called David Alder who had involvement with the EIS, and his work was on visual search and anticipation in badminton players. And he actually when he actually started off, he did a lot of work with elite badminton players, and one of the ones that he did work on was Nathan Robertson, who was he was a silver medalist, wasn't he, with Gail Ems? In I think it was Beijing. So just before he retired, they did some eye tracking of him using some of the tests that you'll have seen, the visual search anticipation tests. So again, for those people, just to describe to that, it was essentially a backlit projector of an opponent, and Nathan Robertson or the badminton players were stood on the other side of the net, and they would play a video of someone doing a shot, and it was the video was occluded just prior to shuttlecock contact or just afterwards. So there are different occlusion criteria, and what they were looking to do was the movement response of the athlete correct in terms of the direction, and when they tested Nathan Robertson against some of the national level players, he was far and away better, particularly in the hardest occlusion conditions. So his level of visual search and anticipation had evolved to such a level. And David continues to do research with kind of international and national level badminton players. So and again, there are experimental designs and constraints in that. But I think there's some really good information there. The challenge is that I've always thought about is that knowledge, is that learned through experience, or can you fast track it? And some of the stuff from Sam Vine and Mark Wilson's group in Exeter, where they've done stuff in military and in surgery, suggests that actually in procedural stuff you can fast track it. Whether that applies to more dynamic environments such as sport, I don't know. But that's where the research is going in that area right now.
You say you can fast track it?
Yeah. So you can essentially train people where to look for the key information. Right. But that's in, as I understand it, in environments where anticipation isn't required. It's just to identify the key visual information. So,
yeah, I mean that's what one of the other presentations that I thought was interesting was Victor Gradin at Brunel. Yeah, he was his stuff was about. I mean, he introduced me to a new term. I kind of knew what he meant, but I'd not heard the term before. The idea of contextual priors. Okay. So that was like the provision of additional information prior to either practice or competition that then that directs the gaze behavior of a performer. So, for example, if I was given instructions about, say, let's just imagine from like you and I were playing hockey, right? And I was given information about your tendencies in attack, so I would then be, I don't know why I'm choosing me as a defender because I'm garbage at defending. But anyway, that's by the by. But you know,
I'm not any better as an attacker, so it'll be an interesting matchup.
Well, we could flip it, but anyway, your tendencies in attack. Let's say I'm playing in attack, and you've got the ball at the back, right? And I've got to press you, right? And you've got a tendency, for example, to like try and cut inside on me and release the ball in field. That might then change my approach pattern to you to deny you that opportunity in order to then force you into different actions, right? But then what that then does is it brings about a change of gaze behavior in terms of what cues I'm looking for on you. Which has a potential benefit, but it may then also mean that I then don't look at the other things that you may then do that could equally be as damaging. Don't think I fully understood his research entirely, but that was certainly my takeaway from it. But what was interesting for me about that as a piece of research was the idea of how perhaps in training we could use contextual priors or cues as a means by which to, and it is something I actually do, which is to focus attention. So I might use a question, for example, which would be a contextual prior, almost say, what do you notice about the way they move their feet? Or what do you notice about where they're playing the ball to? And then that then focuses attention on, so with the group or the individual going, I wonder what they're doing. And then I get them sort of feedback to me or show me their way of tackling that problem. I think I'm using something similar in my training context.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll have to check that one out. Just made a note of that, so that's good.
I think I've probably misunderstood. I remember seeing the outcome. I haven't quite read it, but of course, he's got quite a lot of scientific data that I haven't quite fully appreciated. But my big takeaway was this idea of a contextual prior and the potential opportunity used there. And there's pros and cons to it as well. And I'm pretty sure there is quite a significant con, but I couldn't work out what the con was. Anyway, we'll move on. I'm going down a rabbit hole. That point you made about badminton, though. I mean, it's a really interesting point about, I think, what for me, I'm interested with, like Nathan Robertson, is that there is often, and it's the same, I found the same in golf, right? A massive difference between super elite performers and national level players. So like when they talk about novice and expert, but the expert group might be, elite university players. It's usually university players, isn't it, right? Novice and expert. I actually think there's going to be as much difference between the novice and the elite university player as they're going to be the elite university player and the proper elite, super, the medalists. I think there's often quite a difference there as well. I think you've just alluded to that with some of Dave Alder's research. Yeah. And when I look at that research and people or the research studies describe them as elite, I mean, I suppose in my context, elite would be top 10 in the world. Right. And so therefore, to get all those 10 people in that research study is pretty hard, yeah.
Yeah, so that's why it's interesting when people do things with that one, that n equals 1. But I know for the purposes of research, you have to get certain numbers in. But having that n is equal to 1 as a comparison to say a less elite group. Yeah. And often as well, like the definitions of elite are either done through as a performance level, but maybe not as a representation of their skill level in that task.
Get it?
So sometimes concerns over that, because just because someone's top 100 in the world doesn't mean that they've got good visual search. It might be that they're a good attacker, or it might be that they're really fit and get the ball back a lot. So once you delve down into that, the definition of elite can be done very many different ways.
I mean, it supports Bruce Abernathy's stuff, isn't it? About the idea of elite level performers having contextual cues that happen prior to impact. They're not reacting to where the ball goes. They are on the move almost, whether it's mentally on the move or physically on the move before the ball's been struck. They're picking up cues prior to that point. So it's supportive of that. And I think we're seeing an awful lot of this research. And it's great because it's sort of essentially confirming that hypothesis. What we're not getting a lot of, and this is where I want to start delving into this, is start to understand more about, like you said, what are the mechanics of that? What are the like you say, is it something that can be developed? Is it something that just happens through time? What I would love to see, for example, is to take a piece of research like that and to throw a load of autoethnography around it as well. So, for example, go through Nathan Robertson's history and similar performers like him, and get them to, I mean, I know retrospective accounts aren't ideal, but it gives us something, right? And go back through and then start to say, well, actually, what we're now finding is that elite performers with this level of anticipatory or visual search capability also did a load of these things in their childhood.
Yeah.
That would then start to give us a few clues as to, all right, there might be something in that we can infer from as a training modality that we could then bring to others.
Yeah, and what I'm really interested in is as I kind of alluded to before, is for people to have that anticipatory ability. Do they need to go through a period of experiential learning where they make mistakes and fail and go, well, they might consciously be doing this, but I looked there or tried to pick up that cue and I didn't pick it up early enough. So is there a process of learning through failure or learning through experience that's required, or can it be fast-tracked, particularly in sports-specific context? And there are some far more intelligent people than me that probably know the answers to that right now or have a better idea. And I think, that would be great, is can you accelerate learning?
Well, that brings me, and it might circle us back to your current world of swimming, which we need to come back to. That brings me on to another really interesting piece of research from Ludovic Seifert from University of Rouen.
Yeah.
What fantastic. Really interesting. I mean, he's coming out from a very ecological space, so needless to say, I'm obviously very interested in what he has to say. But what was really, really fascinating by his piece of research, right? So his study. You've probably seen this study, but I'll share it anyway. So his study is looking at essentially learner swimmers or developing swimmers, and I want to come on to talk about propulsion and drag in a minute because that's fascinating.
Nice. Yeah.
But obviously, he was saying that what you get is learner swimmers learning breaststroke tend to move arms and legs more or less at the same time. Mm-hmm. I kind of assume that's in a desperate attempt to not drown. So they kind of learn that, like, oh yeah, and of course because they're moving the arms and legs at the same time, what they're essentially doing is acting like a concertina, and they're creating drag and propulsion at the same time and almost counteracting each other, so it's horribly inefficient. And so what he was saying is, in order to learn to be able to like kick, allow the body to sort of glide using the kick, and then use the arms to then maintain propulsion, and then get. It's a fairly difficult thing to learn how to do to become more efficient at that kind of hydrodynamic propulsion. And so what he's saying is that he then took 4 groups, 8 swimmers, novice swimmers, relatively novice swimmers, and gave them each a different like kind of training condition, and then train them over a piece of time, and then use machine learning to work out what the patterns were, right? So you have to gather a huge amount of data. Although the samples of participants is still relatively small, he's got a huge amount of data because of the number of trials, the number of actions, and the way they recorded them, and then using machine learning to work out what the patterns are. So he's doing pattern recognition. And the fascinating thing about this whole piece of research was the different conditions. So, but before we get onto that, right, I want to just talk about exploration. So he talked about this idea of using an exploratory model, but he talked about this sort of almost like 3 forms of exploration. So one form of exploration is complete, like almost like just give it a go, trial and error, pure trial and error, right? Yeah. And then there's another form of exploration, which is actually step by step. Sort of like almost a bit, it's still exploratory, but it's kind of a bit more directed. It's like saying, right, you've got to go, we're going to sort of tell you the journey, the steps to take on that journey. And then something in the middle, which is where you kind of give enough guidance so people have like an anchor point, and they can explore within that anchor point, and they go, right, okay, it's that, now I can move on to that, now I can move on to that. So that's almost like a bit more of a guided discovery type approach, or a guided exploration type approach. Yeah. So, and he was sort of saying about how there is research out there around exploration that when you use that kind of guided model, that you can actually see some real benefits in terms of sort of rapid skill acquisition. Have you seen that? Has anything similar come across?
Yeah. I suppose when you're talking there, I kind of come back to the use of kind of movement variability to kind of develop that exploration into the movement space. And this kind of brings me into, I suppose a little bit more work stuff where I see a lot of attention paid to gold standard techniques, and athletes must look like a certain model or position. And, in a number of the technical sports that I've worked with, then that's very prevalent. You'll certainly see that in golf. I saw that in archery. I saw that in athletics, and I see it in swimming. So, and undoubtedly, technique and fundamental biomechanics are required for performance. But for me, where people get a little bit confused is the difference between actually what I call the fundamental what's the fundamental scaffolding or framework that's required in order to be proficient in that movement, and what can be accepted as variability around that movement. So you might see, I'll use a golf example because people should be relatively familiar with golf. You'll see it even on the world tour, so many varied and different swings. However, a lot of what I see in the current press is, oh, look at Rory McIlroy's swing, how good it is, or look at Tiger's swing, so on and so forth. But then I look at people like Jim Furyk, who had a loop at the top of his backswing, but was a major winner. You look at John Daly, Bubba Watson. There are things on there which probably some golf pros wouldn't coach, but they've been successful for that. So I think when people are looking at technique, for me they need to think about, right, what are the non-negotiables here? That if people don't do, they're just not going to be successful in the skill. And that's important. That's really important for me that I get that across to people listening, that skill has an outcome associated with it, whereas technique doesn't. So you can do a bad technique and get a good outcome or a bad outcome. But if you're skillful, then you get the outcome that you want with the technique that you use. Yeah. So people need to identify, okay, what are the non-negotiables here for this technique, and what can I allow as variability and exploration of the movement space? And often movement variability is somewhat be considered as noise, and it's to be dulled down and quashed. So actually people think, well, actually the less variability I have here, the better, because people are doing repetitive things again and again and again, so it's going to get better. But actually there's been quite a lot of research where variability has been proven to be useful for exploration and learning. So a certain degree of movement variability can actually be necessary for motor learning and skill. And it's this exploration it's critical for people to identify, okay, if I operate outside here, then I can do it this way. If I operate outside of here, I do it this way. And so there's a great there's a great kind of metaphor that was described to me by Mark Williams about, if you imagine a ball rolling along kind of a flat piece of ground, and then it falls into a channel, and imagine that channel is really deep but really narrow. Then if you consider that width as movement variability, then yes, you can go really deep and repetitive, but you don't have much adaptability outside of that. Whereas if you reduce the depth of that channel, so you still get the outcome that you want, but you increase the width, then you can operate in different ways. So you can operate in the middle way, but actually if the conditions change or something changes about you, and we might chat about this from an ecological perspective, and some constraints change, you can still operate and get the outcome that you want. The other thing with that is around repetitive techniques, is it creates excessive loading and repetition on joints and structures. And again, for people in development, that's probably not good for kids. So when you're referring to the barefoot running of the tribe, there is actually that variable environment is really, really good stimulus for them to operate and use different structures and musculoskeletal aspects, rather than just say running in the same way again and again. And even in running, cycling, there are no two running strikes that are the same. Again, research will show that even in those repetitive tasks, there's repetition without repetition.
And obviously dependent on morphology and your anthropometrics and et cetera, there's going to be differences there. I mean, particularly interestingly with the going back to the running thing, plantar fasciitis doesn't exist amongst those people, because they've developed the musculature and the hardiness, et cetera, and the adaptability in their feet. Their feet are alive and are, it's got the most bones in the body. It's actually a feat of engineering, our foot.
It's incredible.
And we put it in we put it in a shoe that basically makes it go lazy and it's dull. I've actually only just discovered this for myself, by the way. I hate running, right? And I always get bad back, etc., etc. A lot of that's to do with the fact that I was born with, born with a particular condition that doesn't necessarily help me. But I've recently discovered that actually just running in a different way actually makes it the whole experience far better.
Yeah.
Just circling back to the Seafoot stuff, though, I just want to finish it off because there might be people here going, "What? Yeah, sure. Tell me the end." And then I'll ask you to comment on it if I can. What was really fascinating for me, so we've got these 4 conditions and different training modality given to each one. So the first group were pure exploration, right? You just off you go, want you to experience this whole thing. The second group were given a task, and the task was after you kick, try to hold for 2 seconds before you pull your arms. Right, that was their task. There was that was called the analogy group. So they were given the analogy, I think, of I can't remember. They were given some sort of analogy. Yeah. Then there was a pacing group that were told kick, and then they had an auditory sound going ding ding, and then they could pull.
Yeah.
And then there was a group that were given technical instruction. They were told how to perform the action using what you were talking about a minute ago, the gold standard technical model. So the interesting thing about all this was what was found. So the exploratory group stayed in that purely exploratory. So we used this machine learning to kind of work out where the patterns were, and then there is a kind of a channel, I suppose, right? This kind of, I guess, movement channel that is near to where they kind of want to be from a kind of the development of the skill perspective, with still some variation. What they found was there's obviously variation in all 4 of the whole areas. In the first group, though, it was very random, right? So people did a lot of different random things. They began to converge, but it took quite a while, right? The other group, the analogy group and the pacing group. So they're both given basically constraints. One's an auditory constraint, and the other one is a task constraint. They still showed variability, but the variability was much more within closer to the channel. So it was a shallower channel, but they still come out of it, but they stayed closer to it. So they had what I call the anchors, those exploratory anchors. So those constraints gave them the exploratory anchor to play within. Now, the instructional group that were told exactly how to perform the task. Now, you'd expect them to be in a real groove, wouldn't you, and to be a real deep channel. They weren't. They had the most variability in terms of movement. So they were all over the map, even though they were given this instruction. Now, for me, that's like really interesting it's a really interesting finding. And I spoke to Ludovic afterwards that so we tend to operate. I think the debate around coaching tends to sort of seem to be in 2 parallel universes, or not parallel universes, sort of opposite universes. One is almost like a free play, and then the other one is a technical instruction. If you don't have the techniques, you can't possibly. But interestingly, the technical instruction model is counterproductive. Don't know, just be interesting to get your thoughts.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure I've read that research. I've read so much of Seifert's, it kind of all converges and closes into one. But it's interesting that, I suppose for me, it may depend on the competence or the level of the athlete on that. So if they're given technical instruction and they're trying to consciously reduce their movement variability, then they just mightn't have the coordinative structure or the skill to be able to do that. So they end up having so much variability anyway. Whereas those 2 other groups that you had there were 3 others, but the 2 had the task and the pacing, they actually had some goal directed, or they had some goal direction and some anchors, as you say, of which to go, okay, this is going to anchor my kind of coordination and kind of goal directed behavior. So they're able to operate around that. I think what I've seen, and this is very much anecdotally, I'd love to do research on this, just haven't had the time, is as we've worked through, and I've seen this across a number of sports, is that as the people progress in terms of, and I mean progression in terms of performance level, you'll see a reduction in movement variability, and that'll align with outcome variability. So we think movement variability, they start to move more towards a consistency of skill level. And they get better and better and better, and they suddenly get to a point where they are at a really, really good level, and they have low movement variability and low outcome variability. And then what I see with the very best and the elite is something shifts, is that their capability to increase their movement variability increases, and to maintain their outcome variability.
Right.
So the first time I saw this was with the archers. The very best archers had the ability to be flexible and adapt and kind of compensate on execution and still get the outcome that they wanted. And for me, there was a clear differentiation between those people, or that group, and the group below, and that they could operate in normal conditions really, really well. But as soon as those conditions, such as, or so we call it constraint or competition conditions such as anxiety, or the environment changed in terms of wind, or they got fatigued, then they struggle to operate in that normal, their normal operating pattern, and they struggle to adapt. And that there's differentiation there. And I've seen again across a number of sports where, yes, there's a skill level involved, but the elite people can be adaptable and flexible without having an impact on their outcome variability.
So, I mean, that's quite fascinating, isn't it? Those different performers, because that's the other thing about this piece of research. That you did it with 20-year-old university students they're relatively novice swimmers. They need to develop. But my question, I suppose, is if you've got a child, say, who's had less swimming experience, and so less movement pattern that's already been put in place, could a purely exploratory approach help them? You know, all those sorts of things. You know, or what could how could they operate within that? The other thing for me as well was I came away from the with an idea about, and this is just something I wanted to play around with as well. So your point about their ability to change, now that's really interesting for me. And again, I want to find out more about their backstory, because as you were talking about the ball rolling and the groove, right? And the deeper the groove, the harder the ball to explore different spaces in the landscape, right? Now, my point is that it seems to me that what we want to do with kids, and I think swimming is particularly prevalent, is to make that groove as deep as possible early on. Now, some of that is fine because you need to learn some of the movement patterns to be able to perform or stay afloat for a kickoff and then be able to move and all that sort of stuff. But if you do that and you make that groove too deep that it doesn't allow for variability, then later on, it must be very, very difficult to then get an individual to essentially come out of that groove and to refine movement. Whereas if you maintain your scaffold, if you like, the variability scaffold, so you say, we're going to keep you within a parameter, but we're allowed to play around a little bit, then it makes it easier for those people to make adaptations later on, which is then therefore for me another I guess just logical rationale for that more playful approach to learning and development that's got more exploration. I'm not saying it has to be entirely exploratory, but more exploratory opportunities, and then the refinement coming later on, rather than the be technical early, and on the basis that if you don't get it early, you don't do the hours, don't do the miles later on, you're never going to have it. Well, the reality is actually you need variability later on, and you probably do need more adaptability. And if you groove people too early, you could essentially be massively counterproductive later on.
And I think one thing about, especially in development circles, is kids are going to grow. So that that variability is going to be enforced upon them. So if they have a really narrow groove and then they grow, well, and you see that in terms of children's movements, they have a growth spurt and they're totally uncoordinated, where they're suddenly trying to explore their movement landscape again to get that coordination patterns. So we need to allow for that adaptability in a swimming context. That's why you'll see a lot of good youth coaches have their swimmers do individual medley and do all the strokes and not specialize. Because it allows that in a swimming context, allows that exploration. I think, I can't comment because I don't work that much even at the development level, but certainly what I'd like to see as well is even that little bit of exploration and undirected play where the kids can do underwater skills or have little games and stuff like that, where they can not just explore the swimming technique, but they can explore like underwater skills and how to move effectively in the water as well. So, but no, you're completely right. But I think when you were talking there, I was thinking, well, the kids are going to grow. So they need to have that adaptability anyway.
Yeah. So this idea of, and this happens in lots of sports, hours and hours and hours performing more or less the same kind of movement doesn't seem to stack up to me in terms of, I think it feels to me anyway. I mean, like you, I mean, I couldn't do that. I just, me myself, I struggle to stay focused on one thing anyway. So I need the opportunity for exploration just to keep my brain, happy.
Yeah.
But also I just feel like not only is it dull, not particularly exciting, it's also potentially really quite counterproductive.
Yeah, I agree, and that's why, I mean, I think we're verging into early specialization versus early diversification. But I'm hugely on that, and that kids should be trying multiple sports and multiple sports with, something like a swimming or a game-based sport, or maybe one of the ones I really like. So I've got a little girl who's 2 years old, and me and my wife have had debates about what sport she's going to play when she's older. Now, my wife was like a champion Irish dancer,
right?
So she's definitely going to be doing dancing. It's great.
Yeah.
And obviously I play hockey and cycling. She's going to be doing those. But like, one of the things I really would be interested to get her into is like something gymnastics.
Yeah.
For her to develop coordination in kind of a fun environment. Yeah. I think another one is judo, because you learn to fall, you learn to grapple, you learn to move your body.
Yeah.
And then you have other sports, ones that have kicking, throwing, have team elements. So there's some psychosocial aspects there. And then ones such as like cycling or swimming, that's like a technical or a conditioning element to it as well. Yeah, if we do all that, we're going to be busy.
I was going to say, yeah, where are you going to fit the rest of it in?
Yeah, I mean, the key thing for me is whatever they enjoy, whatever they have fun at, and it's not too serious. And then actually, when they do think, oh, actually, I want to push on a little bit this more, I think I'm good at this. Then yeah, let that be the decision maker. But yeah, kind of coming back to your point is, yeah, I mean, I'm very pro, or a very anti early specialization. It's certainly, again, I'm not. It's not a space that I spend a lot of time in terms of kind of in the development area of swimming. But I know that there's a big push in certain spaces that they need to get the volume in. Whereas and you'll see an improvement and a performance level, a kind of mid to late teenage years, and then it starts to drop off again. I suppose again, when I look at sports, particularly swimming, I see it as like a 10-year window to be really, really good. So the earlier that 10-year window starts, then maybe you might have an impact on them being successful at world and Olympic level. So look, I think Adam Peaty, for example, he probably didn't take swimming seriously until, as I understand it, 16 or 17 years old. So he swam before then, but seriously, he hasn't taken it. He didn't take it seriously until those late kind of teenage years. So, and he's 24 now, and he's still there. He's still enjoying it, and you're right in that I can't even. I struggle to see how the guys cope with the monotony. Like, I ask them all the time what they think about when they're staring at that black line in the pool for 20, 25 hours a week. Particularly the guys who do open water, who do about 4 hours of training a day, and. Yeah, I mean, they think about just normal stuff, about what they're going to cook for dinner and stuff like that. But yeah, there's a certain discipline that's required for that kind of training.
My mind would go into some very dark places, I can tell.
Yeah, I know.
I'd be scared.
I know.
This point about, but even if, so for me, again, even if you are, like, I mean, my problem, I think, with a lot of the kids' sport acts at the moment is the seriousness comes far too soon. So I've got a young kid, so his dad's like my assistant coach, and his son is brilliant hockey player, right? He's got lots of attributes, right? He's only little. I think he's about 8, 9, right? Maybe 9, 10, and he's doing swimming as well.
Yeah.
And his club recently came and said, right, you've now got to go to 16 hours a week.
Okay.
And he's like, and his dad came to me and go, what do you think about that? And I said, just ask them to explain what benefit that has for that young player, and to show you the science before you, because he's sort of come in my will, and he's like, he's actually now thinking of pulling him out of swimming. He said, I can't do that. So I think the danger actually for the sport is some of these culturally resilient beliefs, which Ed Collin talked about, are actually really counterproductive from a participatory perspective, and therefore counterproductive if the goal is talent development and performance. It's counterproductive to that because it's reducing the talent pool by being too attritional too early.
Yeah. And I think I was having a conversation with someone on the car up to the airport yesterday. Is hypothetically, if we see the world move into early specialization, will that be the prevalent focus moving forward, and that actually early specialization works because the majority of people early specialize, versus, we have the argument of early specialization versus, late or early diversification. But if there's a generational shift that moves earlier and earlier and earlier, and that's going to be the norm anyway. But if we do that as a country, then what other countries who late specialize, maybe they'll have an advantage over us. And yeah, it filled 40 minutes of a car conversation. It was good.
I think that the interesting thing for me though is that I think many of the historically great sports people, so there are countries out there, aren't there, who do early specialize.
Yeah. They
use highly reductionist approaches, mechanized approaches. Let's take some of the Asian countries. Talk about badminton, for example. I spent some time with badminton, and one of the things they said was they just said, we'll never compete on the world stage. And I was like, why is that then? Because we're up against the likes of Korea, who will basically just hothouse, thousands of children, make them do repetitive movements over and over and over again, and they don't care about the ones that just are on the scrap heap at the age of 12 or 13, because as long as they get a few gold medalists. It's probably a unfair, maybe not quite as bad as that, but anyway, more or less like that. So we can't compete because we can't do that, because our cultural dynamics would see that as being abusive. So we can't do that, we can't compete, we'll never be as good. I'm like, oh no, you've got to see this as an advantage, right? Because all they're producing is individuals who are essentially the survivors of a system designed to make it massively attritional.
Yeah, and I saw that. I mean, obviously, when I worked in archery, Korea are dominate the world in archery. It's one of their national sports. They won in Rio. They won all 4 gold medals that were available, and they just have tons and tons and tons of. So if you think about a competitive level in archery, in male archery being a qualification score 670 or 680, maybe in this country they might have 1 or 2 people that can do that. They've probably 50, 60, 70 people in Korea that can do that, and they continually kind of churn them out. And like, I was lucky enough to go over and kind of see how they train and stuff like that. I mean, they start these kids in preschool with TheraBand, and they start them with the movements, and so again, it's completely against what I've kind of been talking about. Production line and performance perspective, they get the end product. And again, maybe there's a cultural thing of actually, they can deal with the repetition more. It's just part of the culture, and that kind of repetitive practice is accepted. Whereas maybe over in westernized societies, might get a bit more bored, might need a bit more variety. But I mean, that's an approach in certainly in martial arts, but also you could say in maybe even in some things like emergency responses, where it's quite process and drill oriented. That's an approach to take as well, because they just can't afford to have that variability. So, I'm quite open to different approaches to it. I'm probably not I don't sit as strongly in the ecological camp, although I see the values of it. I like to, certainly with the coaches I work with, think about, right, we've got a spectrum of methodologies here, which is appropriate for age and stage. Because certainly when as I said on Wednesday morning, when we look at swimming, it's got a very linear methodology. So there's a lot of repetition. There is technical gold standard models. And where I'm trying to equip the coaches is with, there are other ways in which we could do this if you're not being successful. But given that most of your athletes and all of your coaches have grown up in this linear pathway, I'm not asking you to completely shift, because that would be hugely unreasonable, and I probably wouldn't be allowed back in the building as a result of that. But I don't sit in one camp. I try and utilize some of the strengths and some of the opportunities that a lot of the methodologies allow.
Yeah, I mean, Richard Shorter introduced me to this kind of behavior change framework, and he said, there's broadly speaking four methods of changing behavior. You've got hug, nudge, shove, smack. And so you're very much, with the work that you're doing, trying to sort of bring about a bit of a cultural shift amongst sort of the coaches and obviously in your role, you've got one of the reasons that, you're doing the stuff with analysis and the stuff with biomech and then bringing the skill act research and then also the innovation stuff, I suppose, is to bring that additional credibility and validity to some of these approaches. And then that then acts as a reinforcer. So all the time, I suppose, you're staying in that kind of nudge a little bit, shove a little bit, but never going so far as to say, right, that guys, what you're doing is garbage, do this. Because that you're probably likely to get that too much rejection at that point, aren't you?
I mean, I'm hugely fortunate in that I have the analysis side and the, I suppose, the technological side in which we will assess and measure things. So then I'm in the space where I can go, well, actually, can we try it this way? And then I'm able to ascertain, over a period, or longitudinal periods of time, whether, things are getting faster or not. I mean, lucky in swimming, and it's a time-based thing. It's not as open as some of the other sports where it's harder to measure kind of performance improvement. But we sit in those spaces, and again, I'm hugely fortunate in that I can go poolside and have those conversations with the coaches and understand where they're having challenges, and then suggest to them, well, actually, let's think about doing it this way, or let's try and frame the problem slightly differently, or have we asked the athletes and how they're feeling around this? So as much for me as it is about measurements and science, it's also about trying to help the coaches problem solve and give them the tools to make their athletes go faster.
And you're, I guess, sometimes providing them with the information and the data to be able to inform their decisions.
Yes. Yeah. But also being aware that, I chatted about kind of performance learning distinction is on Wednesday is, if we try an approach and it's regressing over a period of weeks, setting the expectation of the coaches that actually that might need to happen, which is a hard one for coaches because they want performance on a short-term basis. So if it's going the wrong way, they do get slightly nervous, and understandably so. But trying to set that expectation that actually something that you might have done, you might see performance change in 2 weeks, but when you moved on to something else, it still regressed again, is actually about doing it an alternative way. It might take 5-6 weeks, but it will be a little bit more robust and stand up when we move on again. So it will be consolidated, and it will maintain there.
On that subject, you shared some really interesting stuff, I thought, on Wednesday around the work you did around Adam Peaty's start.
Yeah. So I think, again, for those with a knowledge in swimming, they'll know Adam Peaty. For those who don't, obviously Adam is British swimming's probably standout performer, and he's a multiple world record holder and won gold in Rio, and that'll be his goal for Tokyo. And he swims in the 100-meter breaststroke. And yeah, I mean, he's an incredible athlete in terms of his power, his strength, his ability to swim fast using a high stroke rate. But one of his weaknesses compared to his opponents is kind of his start and his underwater skills. So that's been probably a major focus of my work in the last 2 years, is how we can get faster there. And again, lucky with his coach, who's Mel Marshall, really great coach, really open to a lot of this variation and different stimulus that we can do with Adam. So yeah, we've used a combination of kind of biomechanics and a little bit of skill acquisition just to help him improve that area. And as I said on Wednesday, we know it's improved. We know it's gotten better. I can't attribute it to all the work that we've done. I think if I was to reflect on the work that we've done, it's just that we've done some deliberate practice with some clear goals as to why we're doing that stuff for him to improve. And it's culminated in him getting faster and not being so far behind at 15 meters anymore.
And having to catch up all the time.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that was, I mean, he's still winning by a country mile, but the important thing for him is he's not just involved in individual events, he's involved in relay events. So, and of course, everybody wants to get faster and break world records. So it's still really, really important that we continue to move him on. How
did you identify his start? I mean, was it quite obvious in terms of just the fact that he was like, his head was coming up behind everyone else, or was it something he identified? Was something you sort of sat down with Mel and discussed and tried to work through?
It's within, I suppose, the swimming world. It's pretty obvious when he's on the blocks and he starts, and then he's half a body length behind from 15 meters. Swimming's really good at that. It's when you go to a race and you think, oh, they're looking good, and then they line up beside someone who's the fastest in the world, and someone on the other side is the second fastest in the world, and it makes you look artificially inferior in certain sections. But it was something that I'd been asked Mel to work with around any ideas, and obviously he's a standout athlete, so it was an objective of mine to try and improve that as well. So partly as well, just to get some belief and trust with the coach. So sure. if you do stuff out in PD, it goes well, then actually he must know what he's talking about. Is hopefully the angle that I was going with, and that's not necessarily the case 100% of the time, but that was probably a tactic of mine to try and get a quick win with a leading figure like that.
And some of your approaches, the approaches that you've kind of worked together to develop, and you bring in some of that kind of skill act lens to support the coach. And I know Mel's I don't know, I've not met Mel, but I've heard of her, and I know she's really open and bought in and very keen to learn continuously. But she so she would have been receptive, but you're co-designing, I suppose. You bring in a slightly different lens, and and asking some questions, and then working through different ideas and all that sort of stuff. You're co-designing the training approach, or the kind of the things that you would do with him. Yeah. But none of them are necessarily tried and tested, are they? They're new. So there's no guarantee that they're going to work. So there's a bit of risk on your part, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. Yeah, and this is, even if we're modifying a skill, I can't say that it's going to get better. But I suppose we're using a little bit of experience and intuition to say, well, actually, if we have a little bit more variability around this, and we frame the problem as, right, we're trying to reduce your drag or increase your propulsion. We know X, Y, and Z from science. We know that, you're creating this amount of drag in this position. If we could reduce that, it's likely to make you faster. So, we can't 100% say for sure, but there's a probability around some of this stuff. It's not, I suppose what I'm trying to get across, is not completely guesswork. Yeah. And with the science and some of the skill act principles, of which we'll take from the research, and then trying to convey that in a swimming language or a coaching language, then the coach then makes that swimming specific into their sessions, and then we get a good outcome. And there's a little bit of experimentation around that, where we'll go with Mel, say, I don't think that's working, and we've given it enough time to allow, or Adam will come back and go, I don't feel that's working, I don't feel that's beneficial for me. So there's a little bit of, okay, we'll take that out, but actually we'll keep this bit and moving forward. So but I think that's the mark of kind of any good kind of coaching relationship and support, is you identify the bits that work for you, and you throw out stuff that maybe once you've tried and tested isn't relevant.
So very, very important, that, isn't it, in terms of, and a bit missing, I would say, particularly in the kind of youth and talent development space, is how much the coach and whoever they've got, often in the talent development space, coaches don't have the benefit of you with both data and knowledge and all those sorts of things, and actually some of the crazy ideas and the crazy questions and the innovation and the different things to consider, they don't have that. So the risk factor becomes higher. But for me, an important factor here is that whole ability to tap into the most important source of feedback, which is athlete. And they can tell you kind of, as they become more skillfully attuned and more aware of things, they should be the person that is providing feedback. We're not going to give them feedback. They've got to give it to us. Yes. And then we can then cross-reference. We can act as what you are experiencing, or you perceive you're experiencing, I'm not observing, or I am, and we concur, and all those sorts of things. That's got to be the approach that I would suggest. Yeah. But that's often not part of the mix here, is it?
Yeah. And I think I like to think of a scenario where, say, I take you into the world of swimming, and Stu, you're more than welcome anytime. And we set up a session out in PT, and I give you enough of a brief, and probably from your coaching ability and your ability to ask questions and seek feedback from Adam, you could probably coach him and say, right, we're going to focus on your starts today. The problem is, we're going to try to reduce your drag in a certain aspect, and we're going to get your feedback and then measure that by time. And I'd like to think that someone with a good coaching ability and someone with an elite performer who's attuned as that could ask enough questions and prompt and guide for that to be a productive coaching session without needing the sport-specific knowledge.
No.
Because sometimes, and we get drawn into providing movement solutions to our athletes that aren't appropriate for that person. So it's our movement solution to that person. Yeah. And it's our solution to their problem when a lot of, again, what we're talking about is we're trying to create problems for the athletes to solve. So why do we give them the answer to that problem?
Yeah.
Isn't it far better? Like if I got you to do a crossword and Stu, if I give you all the answers, that's not very much fun for you, is it? Versus...
So it defeats the object, doesn't it?
Yeah, it defeats the object versus...
It's just filling in boxes then.
Yeah, there you go. I'm going to tell you all the answers. You're just going to be a scribe for me. Versus actually, I'm giving you a challenge and a problem, and if you need some help and some guidance, so there's a phrase, somebody used it the other day, handrails, not handcuffs.
Oh, brilliant.
So we're guiding and we're challenging the athletes to find their own solution to the problem. And what's better than someone figuring it out for themselves, rather than telling them the answer? But, and I do this all the time. And especially with my little girl, and even I see it in my job on a day-to-day basis to do it is, I can see the answer there. I want to be the best person and give that to you. But actually, can we try and guide the person to find that themselves? So I talked about on Wednesday with a couple of coaches, this rule of 3 is when they saw the solution to the problem is to bite their tongue and ask a question. I think Ed had another one where he just didn't say anything at all. Is when we see the answer, can we ask a question to help guide them towards that potential, the solution? And if we're still struggling, then actually on the 4th time, then can we be a little bit more leading and directive around that? And that just, for me, it just leads, the reason why we do that is just, again, for the athletes or the individual to find solutions to their own problems, that if they figure out themselves, I believe, and leaning on some of the research here, it's likely to stick and be consolidated more, particularly when it gets tested.
So that rule of 3 differs from the rule of 3 we've spoken about on the podcast before, which is you're basically constraining the coaches. So again, nice little nudge, and saying, here's a rule of 3. Every time you see a technical solution, rather than giving that, you're gonna ask a question, and after 3 questions, if they still haven't quite got where you want them to get to, then you can provide them with it. Is that right?
Yeah. So it's just trying to get the coaches that thinking about that. Okay, can we try and get the athlete to solve the problem here? Yeah. Or start to solve the problem. And as I alluded to on Wednesday, like when you're in an environment where your problems are always solved for you, and you suddenly start asking questions, that's a bit of a shift, a bit of a mindset change. So you have to be patient around that. When athletes aren't used to giving that level of feedback, then A, they struggle to give feedback, and B, they struggle to give context-rich feedback. Yeah. So
that happened to Tony Milicello,
Really?
Yeah, we're working with Jess. He'd done some training stuff, done some learning and development, and discovered the idea of questions. So started asking him a load of questions. She turned around to him and said, "Why are you asking me questions? Just tell me what to do." Yeah. You've never done this before. Yeah.
So then there's a balance for that as well, is to suddenly then shift to right, trying to get the athletes to do solutions all the time mightn't be appropriate. It might be a kind of a drip feed in. Yeah. And there might just be times where you just have to be frank and honest and give them the answer to get the kind of the outcome that you want, because there's a barrier there. And that's, there's no magic answer for that. That's just a skill of coaching, and some of the coaches are far better at it than me.
One question I wanted to ask you, but obviously we didn't get much chance for questions, but a question I was going to ask you was, did you find that there were any coaches, when you sort of brought the rule of 3 in, kind of went through the motions on the questions just so they could get to the tell bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. and so in terms of, I probably work with about 6 or 7 key coaches on a regular basis. And I would say I'm only doing this with maybe 3 or 4. There are others who've talked about this, and there hasn't been the engagement or curiosity for me to pursue it further.
Right.
So it mightn't be I mightn't do it as explicitly with them, or I might just have the relationship I have with coaches is really important. It's a coach-led essentially program, so it will vary where the coach allows me to do stuff directly with the athletes, but that's only with their permission. Or they might have a scenario where I feed into the coach and then they take that and work directly with the athlete. Whatever is most suitable. But certainly some of the stuff I've talked about, I don't do it with everybody. It's only where I feel that the coach is curious and engaged and can kind of apply that. Others will just do what they normally do.
And so in that scenario, the other bit for me that's interesting is I thought around the whole idea of the questioning thing is that there are obviously different types of questions. And of course, there are more leading ones and less leading ones.
Yes.
But I wonder whether an additional constraint, I don't know whether you've done this or not, could be around the idea of if after the 3 questions they haven't yet got where they need to get to, or you're not sure you're getting there kind of thing, is that you might offer them something as opposed to give them the solution. So you might say, draw their attention to it, for example. So the question really should draw their attention to it. But before we get to the point of, right, I'm going to give you the solution, actually offer them something that might lead to the solution. So a clue.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've done that. Rule of 3.
Yeah.
I quite like Amy Price's stuff. She talks about you can get a challenge or a clue or a question.
Yeah.
And you can, the athlete sort of says, oh, I need a clue now.
Yeah.
It's like a phone a friend.
Yeah.
And I just wonder whether that might be an interesting kind of extra little dynamic to throw into the mix there.
Yeah, definitely. I've just noted that down. I think we have to be. It's probably interesting to our athletes is if the athletes know that the coach has a solution, they'll probably go, just tell me.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? That there's an element of impatience, I probably think. So whereas if we're framing it as, listen, we're trying to get you faster, we're trying to find a solution to this problem, let's work on it together. It depends on how it's framed around that. I think another route we might have gone as well is after 3 questions and we're making progress is if we change maybe the focus of attention.
Yes.
So something around that we might have been working on their perception of drag and a certain variation that we were doing. But if suddenly we then go and actually let's have a little race when we're doing this, then it changes the attention focus and then that changes the behavior and then subsequently might change the feedback and stuff like that. So changing the task constraints might then help them to find that solution.
There's a big difference, I think, as well between and I think this is where a lot of people sort of go wrong. And if you're a very technique-led coach, right, and you see the world of performance and improvement and learning from the perspective of changes to technical movement, that's your world, right? And you're trained to look at people's movement patterns and spot kind of either using, I know how they like to use stopwatches and stuff, but using observation or whatever it is, spot inaccuracies and fix the inaccuracies, going back to the idea of the gold standard, right? Even if you embrace the questioning thing, that's where that impatience comes from, right? Because look, don't just because, you're being a clever coach now, ask me some questions to get me to a point. We're playing a game now. Just tell me the thing, right? Give me it. I can get that, right? But if you frame it entirely differently, this is where the whole ecological lens comes from my perspective, because it actually requires you to frame human learning in an entirely different way. So actually, if I say, listen, I don't know anything, right? The only person who knows anything is you. I've got some things I can see, but actually, I'm more interested in what you perceive or know or are experiencing. And actually, the reason I'm asking you questions is because that's the information I need, the information from your perception, and then we can begin to have a conversation about perception. It takes me back to a previous episode with Kendall McQuaid where he described, I think you talk about golf, right? So it's a similar game, right? Golf, very technically led. So you've got coaches doing one of two things. They're watching ball flight and inferring a fault from the ball flight. It's a deductive process. It's literally like painting by numbers. I've done the course, I know. So they're inferring from ball flight, right? And they're going, right, ball's doing that, they're doing this, right, this is my solution. It's literally that simple. And in some cases, Why people pay money for this, I really don't know. Anyone could know this, right? Or the flip side is what they're doing is they are genuinely looking at movement either through the use of video, or they're looking at the athlete and they're seeing what the athlete's doing and going, I see the movement, right? We can work on this now. Kendall McQuaid flipped it. He turned his body around and he stood in front of, well, not directly in front, it's not a dangerous place, but to say, and he never looked where the ball flew. And he never looked where who she was doing. He purely and simply asked her what she was experiencing. And then they conferred over whether what she was experiencing was what he was observing, but never using ball flight. Now, this was a group of national level coaches in English golf who just could not conceive of working in that way. Because they're based on they're working either on this technical model. And I'm wondering whether if in a swimming's very technically driven as well. Individual sports tend to be, don't they? But whether it could be, you know, an interesting constraint to go, actually, you're blindfolded, or you can't see what they're doing. You haven't got a watch, so your only source of information becomes the athlete. Might be an interesting experiment. I don't know whether that's been done anywhere.
I definitely identify with that. I'm not sure of any research around it, but because what you're saying, what you're alluding to there is where coaches will look at the movement effect rather than the movement cause.
Exactly.
And again, you'll see this in a number of technical sports. Your golf example there, say the golfer hits the ball, it's a massive hook. In your mind to go, okay, a hook is caused by X, Y, and Z, and then great causal inference. Okay, that's what I think I've seen. Try and fix this. Whereas again, the best coaches I've worked with, and I saw this a lot in athletics, is they would identify the movement cause to what they were seeing. So often we did an eye tracking study with elite athletics coaches, and it was with Dave Alder, who I just referenced, and we wanted to know what elite athletics coaches looked at when they were watching sprinting versus say a movement coach such as a strength and conditioning coach. And I mean, this was never published. It was just kind of internally at the Institute of Sport. And what we saw is that is that S&C coaches, when they watch sprinting, they would tend to look at the more distal limbs. So they would tend to look at knees, ankles, and hands in terms of their visual gaze. Whereas the athletics coaches would tend to look more kind of proximally towards the core. Because that's the information they were trying to pick up to understand the movement and any movement effects. Because obviously in terms of sprinting, kind of core stability and the slings of movement are controlled through the core. So they were trying to understand how the hip and the pelvis and were working. Whereas the people who are less experienced in watching sprinting were watching the movement effect of, say, too much rotation or, not enough flexion, that kind of thing. And I very much identify with that as, again, we're the best coaches, and as they develop, they go, right, okay, they see a movement effect, but they go through their library of information and go, well, I've experienced this before, and it's not that, it's this, and it might even be technical. It might be a kind of a musculoskeletal imbalance. So that's again, when we bring that back to swimming, the extra challenge is a lot of this is happening in the water, so they can't even see what's happening anyway. So again, they will see too much splash, or they will see something else happening. So how can you attribute that? And that's where we try and help the coaches is I try and help them see what they can't see, either because the water is there or because the movement's happening too quickly. But then we need to be careful not to jump to conclusions because you see a movement effect that, okay, let's fix that. Well, actually, it's not that we might need to fix, I say in inverted commas fix. It might be further up the chain. So it might be a kind of muscular imbalance. And actually, do we even need to address it? Is it acceptable variability? So those are the kind of conversations I have to make sure that we're doing due diligence over some of the things that we're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because something that you just sort of touched on there a little bit is the sort of difference between, in my opinion, coaching and kind of training and instruction. So like Ludovic Seifert yesterday said, a pedagogue, so in my word, a pedagogue being a coach, or somebody responsible for somebody else's learning, particularly a child's learning, is not an instructor, and they are a designer of a learning experience. And that for me is a kind of quite a fundamental shift, because it changes. You're not there to You're not there to correct somebody's movement. It's fundamentally changing your role, right? Your role is not to correct somebody's movement. It might be, because that might be one of the things that is required, but that's not the starting point.
Yeah, we need a picture of a joystick or a puppeteer.
Exactly.
I mean, that's what I think about. Is right. You're essentially moving them like a puppet on strings.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, marionette. Yeah. So you're not there to do it. You're there to you're not there to do you're there to design a learning experience, and to then allow the individual to kind of, I guess, play back to you kind of what they're experiencing, and again we can refine from there and all those sorts of things. My point is that and I think it's the same with instruction and training as well, because I imagine as well a lot of coaching in CGS, centimeter gram second sports, very time led, whatever, tends to focus on more of a training approach, which is a physio. I'm going to do going back to the engine analogy that I used earlier. I'm going to build your engine to get fast. And some of them then also develop the idea of, and now there are technical elements to this. There are propulsion components and drag components which are required to become fast. So we will improve your technique, which is become fast. What they're not good at is being what I think the biggest gap, and this is all coaching, not just swimming, but all coaching, right, is this understanding of how an individual best goes through a process to develop the movement capability to become faster or whatever it is. Yeah. And the assumption is, I tell you where you're going wrong, you can then make the correction. And what Seifert's basically showing us, or at least his studies showed us, or suggest to us, is perhaps there's an alternate paradigm that we need to be exploring. Yeah.
And that's particularly in those CGS sports. I love that term. I haven't heard that before. Is do you train the engine or do you train the skill base first? And I kind of come back to the cycling conversation. Is I'm very much, let's train the skill base. It's given, for one of a better term, fundamental movement skills of cycling, and you can always train the engine later. That will always be there, and develop it. But if they miss out on that critical phase of kind of skill development, then they may lose that. And I've spent endless amount of hours, for one of a better phrase, deconstructing athletes in biomechanics that we've received up through a development level of somebody got on a program, and we then we then do some reductionist stuff where we look at them and go, we need to strip you right back, give you the skills and the elements that you require before moving you on again. Otherwise, you won't make a level of performance. And again, a lot of that is done based. There are flaws in that for me. A lot of that's done based on kind of gold standard technical models and stuff like that. But those conversations are probably had where we look at this person and they go, we just don't feel there's a non-negotiable here that you're just not able to do. And it kind of leads me into movement is either done, in my view, and this is, I've heard this on kind of some Rob Gray's podcasts, around movement is directed by either safety or stability. So safety is the kind of thing of is the outcome safe? Is the movement safe? And actually, is it pain-free as well? If people are in pain, they will adapt their movements to make it pain-free. We see that all the time. But also stability. So the body will search for something that's stable, both intrinsically, in terms of your joints and your coordination and your muscle structures. If something's unstable, you won't go to that place. So if you think of your channel, your well, you won't go to somewhere where that's unstable if your body doesn't have the ability to do that. But also in terms of extrinsically, in terms of the outcome, if it's unstable in terms of where you're going to go to, then you will stay away from that. So we have to allow people to be safe and stable in some of the movements, and that's not just certainly within swimming. We will work intrinsically their coordination, their strength, and their ability to then to be able to access that as well in the pool. So what I kind of referred a little bit to it about how we do land-based stuff to increase their movement literacy and their coordination, so that then they can access that in the pool. Because they are doing quite repetitive movements all the time, So they never get that variation of movement to go, oh, actually I can move this way now and access it, and actually it helps me solve this problem a little bit better. So those are the kind of things which I think are even important at a development level. You get enough stimulus and variability so that you increase someone's movement literacy, and that's why, again, same thing is different sports, different experiences help to develop that.
It's important to define movement literacy, I think, which is, or certainly how I define it. I'm actually meeting Margaret Whitehead on Tuesday, who wrote some of the seminal work on physical literacy. So I'll be interested to see what her views are. But for me, I think the way physical literacy has been interpreted and therefore rolled out, particularly within education context, is conforming to a norm. An agreed set of parameters, I suppose. Education's bereft and full of benchmarking. For me, I think physical literacy is about kind of both procedural and declarative knowledge about the action that they're performing.
Yeah.
And I think that's a different thing, because that requires us to get athlete response and also performance. But it's more. It's not just that they can do it procedurally, but they can kind of articulate it as well a little bit, and they've got a bit of a sense of what's happening. Yeah, and for me, that's a little bit missing. Just I know people will be screaming at me to go, but what does he actually do? Right? Give me practicals. So you mentioned some of the land-based stuff as an example, just so as an entry point into that. What kind of stuff would you do on a land-based? Because a lot of people might say to me, hang on, that's not very representative. So what kind of stuff would you be doing there that might have that, give them something they can access in the pool?
Yeah, so Claire, so I don't necessarily do it with the athletes. I will I'll have those conversations with the physiotherapist and S&C coach. So my role is
be one of the designers. Yeah,
be one of the designers, but is to see stuff that's happening in a pool context and go, okay, we want someone to be faster in a certain section, or we have this problem we're trying to solve in a pool based, and go, well, actually, can land based stuff for the S&C and physio help with that? Okay. So we'll look at so the problem. We'll try and look at the problem in terms of, okay, is it a coordination problem in the pool and that we have to work on there, or actually is it something that they're physically limited in terms of mobility or joint range or strength or power?
Right.
So then it probably comes more into the physio and SSC domain to develop that. In terms of the land-based stuff, what we'll try and do with the athletes is as if we're trying to improve that movement literacy is so a specific example might be kind of fly kicking in swimming. So underwater, it's sometimes referred to as the fifth stroke. Someone like a Michael Phelps was exceptional at it and had a huge performance advantage because of his ability. And that requires a high level of coordination and segmental dissociation. So I'll just explain that term. That's the ability to move your segments. So your thorax, your pelvis, your upper legs, your lower legs in sequence. So in a proximal to distal sequence. Highly coordinated movement, and some swimmers struggle to do that. So what we'll do on land based is help them. We do dissociation work where we go, okay, move your pelvis independently of everything else. Yep. So we start to help them develop this movement literacy and those coordination and those connections between segments, and do a period of work under the guise of kind of physio and S&C. So it might be stuff that's Pilates or Pilates reformer work, or stuff that's on medicine ball or with medicine ball or gym balls. Or the S&Cs and physios design that kind of stuff. I just kind of create the idea for them and they take it away. And then after a period of time, we might bring the swimmer back into the pool and start addressing that pool-based scenario. And actually, we think you have a movement literacy increase now based on what the physio and S&C coaches are saying. Can you then access that in the pool and help it to solve this problem of increasing your propulsion or reducing your drag or swimming faster? So it's a little bit, okay, if we do a little bit of work over here, can it have an impact over here? And yeah, I can see where people might say it's not representative, but we don't just it's again, it probably aligns to our conversation of we don't want to be doing swimming movements in the pool and outside of the pool. So how can we add that variation so that it adds to the specific movements in the pool?
Yeah. And it's actually, representativeness is always based on context. So you're as representative as you can be.
Yeah.
You can't always be in the most representative form of, say, football would be to play 11 aside.
Yeah.
But if you do 11 aside all the time, you might not get enough goes of a particular movement actively, or enough opportunities to observe a particular sort of thing and perceive that certain actions. So you reduce down again the variability, don't you, in order to be able to give but it's finding the sweet spot. What you don't want to isolate completely.
No.
That's a really interesting. I just wanted as well, because before we sort of begin to wrap up, you also mentioned, you showed a video of, I don't know which swimmer it was. It might have been Adam, but it might not have been another one. And you with a piece of rope and pulling them along.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a bit weird, eh? What's going on there?
So that is, again, as I said on Wednesday, we're again framing some of these problems, and I'm boiling down swimming to its very simple, to its simplest parts, in that it's swimming's either propulsion or drag. And then if you want to swim faster, you either increase your propulsion, maintain your drag, or you decrease your drag, maintain your propulsion. So it's a combination between the two. And that's how we frame some of the problems with the swimmers. So a lot of my remit is on kind of starts, turns and finishes, and the skills that are required to be proficient at those. Mm-hmm. And the specific example I was shown was in breaststroke swimming, and we were using what we call bungees, so elastics, to pull the swimmer in to increase the propulsion, to heighten their awareness of drag. So if they were swimming faster than they would do normally, they would feel more of the water in certain areas. And then after we do those, then we ask the swimmer, okay, what do you notice? What do you feel? And they will give us feedback on, I felt it more at the top of my shoulders. I need to improve my line to improve my efficiency. So we'll then work in that area. So it's a task constraint to change the perception, and then it'll alter the movement behavior.
And then conversely, you pull them with the bungee as well, and that gives them a better sense of awareness of their propulsive capability.
Yeah, so we increase their resistance on them, so that they are more aware of their kind of propulsive abilities. So it's like an overspeed or an underspeed criteria.
Could you do the same sort of thing? It's a much more technologically advanced and expensive thing to do, but I know it exists. Could you do the same sort of thing using a current?
And like flumes?
Yes.
Yeah. I suppose the feeling is slightly different there. In the water is moving around you. You're propelling, but the water is moving around you. So it's a moving stream of water, versus in the pool, you're moving yourself through the water.
Okay, of course, yeah.
The feeling is slightly different, but those kind of things can be done and utilized. And what's beneficial there is actually relative to the movement of the water. The swimmer is actually quite static, so you can use cameras and kind of live feedback in that scenario. Whereas in swimming, we kind of, I would call, have a delayed feedback loop, in that someone has to do an action and then see the video or get feedback. Whereas in other sports, you can do it a little bit more live.
Do you use different elastic tensions?
No, they'd probably just move further away from me to get more tension.
Okay.
That's a good idea. I like that. Yeah.
It's a stupid question, you think?
No, it's good. That's why I like the conversations like this, because I've obviously been in the environment for 2 years, so I'm norming into the way of thinking.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, in the first couple of months, I had, I was benefited by naivety and be able to ask these stupid questions. So that's why I like people they're coming into the environment are asking these questions, because like, I never thought of it like that. So it stimulates those kind of naive ideas.
Yeah, it's to use a hydrodynamic analogy. I always, whenever going into organizations, it's like, you want to be the kind of the slightly rough stone that the water has to destabilize around.
Yeah.
And then the minute you become the smooth pebble, you need to sort yourself out again, don't you?
And that's why I think, like, for anybody going into a new organization, the first couple of months are probably the most important time, because you're there with a fresh face, fresh eyes, and you're able to, call a spade, essentially, and go, well, why are you doing that? It's just the norm. It's culturally resilient, isn't it? So.
Yeah. It's just become. They're things you just don't even think about. You don't even see anymore, do you?
I know. Yeah. You become blinkered. It's the normal. Whereas with somebody, it's like I spend a lot of time in airports, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
and I spend a lot of time watching people, and in a crowd of 200, you'll instantly pick out the person who's limping, won't you? Because they're different.
Yeah.
So yeah.
What was I going to say then? The other thing I was going to say is because what made me think about the different tensions, elastic tensions, is I did this like home-based like training thing, and it's one of these things where if you're in your hotel room, you can. You haven't got weights, so you use those like elastic things that you can use and you take different types of tension in order to bring about a different physiological effect. And I just thought to myself, there's something in that, isn't there? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. All right, I'll tweet you when we bring that into the training.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to that one. Listen, right, I'm conscious that it's been a really good conversation, flown by as always. Really glad I could get you on, and I've learned loads. You are fairly active on Twitter, I would say.
Yeah, I suppose I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with Twitter at times. I'll be on it a bit, and then sometimes I don't. So it's really good for me in terms of getting connections with people and research and picking up a load of things. So, people, if they want to contact me, by all means, get me on Twitter. It's at Olly Logo, so that's OLLYLOGO. I'm sure if they just search Olly Logan on Twitter, they'll be able to find me. But yeah, more than welcome to kind of field questions. And obviously I live in Northern Ireland, but I spend most of my week over in England and in kind of Loughborough, Bath, and even up in Scotland in Stirling. So if people want to grab a coffee, then more than happy if diaries allow. So
yeah, you not long ago I put that out there on Twitter, didn't you? And I think a lot of people took you up on that offer.
Yeah, I haven't done that in a couple of months now, just because diary isn't allowed. But I try and do like skill act meetups, where we just find a place and people just come and chat about sport and something that they're interested in.
Not least of which, the big meetup, because as I alluded to at the start of the Movement Skill Acquisition Island, this thing, I believe that the Difficult Second album is in the making, and there'll be an event sometime next year. Am I right?
Yeah, so we're going to have an event in 2020. We suppose to do it on a yearly basis, I think Ed would go mad around Cork. I mean, our intention is to move it around the island of Ireland, but these things aren't easy to organise. But yeah, so watch the space on kind of Twitter for sometime in 2020. We're going to meet to decide dates and hopefully have another successful event, because I suppose a little bit of last year was a little bit of dipping a toe in the water to see will there be interest. So we were blown away by the support and the interest that was shown in it. So we're hugely motivated to do another one.
It was a fantastic event, I have to say. I mean, I was really pleased that I was able to go and kind of play a little part, and as a bit of a sneak preview for podcast listeners, I know we've had some early stage conversations about how we might be able to sort of do a bit of collaboration and some innovative things using technology to extend the reach. Yes. So watch this space on that as well.
Yeah. So thanks for your support on that, and also thanks for the podcast. I spend a lot of time listening to you either on planes or in cars, Stu. So you do a really good job with this podcast, kind of spreading some of the messages into the kind of coaching community. So really good work.
Well, as today is evidence of, it's only as good as the guests. So I appreciate your time for coming on, and I know you're really busy, but fantastic to have the conversation, and all the best for the future of British swimming.
Cheers. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.
So there you have it. Oh, what a great chat that was. Great to get Olly on. Tried to get him on a couple of times, and our schedules, he's a busy fella, and our schedules just wouldn't align. So brilliant to hear him talk. And I saw him at the conference and said, right, don't go before you've got your diary. And we managed to make this one happen, which was brilliant. So much in that. I mean, where to start? I mean, who knew we were going to start talking cycling, cyclo-cross, skill acquisition in cycling, into swimming. Oh man, so much in there. I do like this idea of kind of this idea of how you might develop, working, not trying to not make a technical groove that's too deep, keeping it shallow to allow for exploration. It's a fascinating idea. I also love the idea of not having handrails, but not having handcuffs, but having handrails. So we're guiding. That's providing the kind of the edge, so it's a safe exploration space. I also love his constraint, that idea of the rule of three. Boom, what a great idea that is. A different rule of three, not Mark Bennett's rule of three, a new rule of three. 3 questions before we give the answer, but do it honestly, do it properly. Loads in there. Thanks, Ollie, great to have you on, and fantastic conversation. Now, for anybody interested in ongoing learning, Conclave is open. Some people have vacated, so we've got some space to join our exclusive little throng. Intrepid people, learners, don't be put off. It's very open. Everybody's there with a genuine sense of exploration, questioning, helping each other out with the problems that we're facing, and really working through a few challenges. So if you want to get involved, head over to the website, click on the become a patron button. You'll see the option to join the conclave. Click on there, and and we'll have you on. We meet the first Monday of every month at 8 p.m. in the evening. So be great to have you on board. In the meantime, have a great week of coaching, and remember, ditch those drills.